Welcome to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 83 years old now, and for the last 6 years we have produced a weekly podcast. Today our guest is Ed Larson. He is a university professor at the Caruso School of Law in Pepperdine University. His new book is titled American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795. I'm joined by 17 of my Harvard classmates. So why don't we start with Richard?
Well, Richard Rothstein, Harvard 63, like everybody else you'll meet today, just about. I'm now on Cape Cod, a writer, mostly retired, but can't retire.
Yeah, mostly retired. Ronnie?
Ron Black, class of 63. Started in TV and video a week after graduation, and I'm still doing it on a voluntary basis.
Okay, Bill?
Bill Collins went in the Navy after graduation, 20 years, retired Westinghouse for a while in Pittsburgh, came to Aiken, South Carolina to work at the Savannah River site, from which I am now retired, but still in Aiken.
Okay, Connie?
Yes, after Radcliffe 63, I went to Harvard Law School. I'm now retired, and right now I'm in upstate New York, working on my neglected garden.
Okay.
Here all summer.
John?
Oh, hi. Yep. John Woodford, 63, retired editor, writer, and here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And that's it.
Roger?
Roger Phillimore, Kinvara, County Galway, Ireland, family historian and gardener.
Okay.
Yay!
Nick?
Nick Bancroft, class of 63, business school, Harvard Business School, Peace Corps in India for a couple of years, back here with investments, and then retired to Medfield outside of Boston.
Okay, Allison? Cindy?
Allison Wardle, always called Cindy, class of 63, where Connie and I were roommate. We were only roommates later, I think. Yeah, but freshman year we weren't up to as many pranks, I don't think, but a few pranks. Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Okay, John, Eric.
Class of 63, although I didn't graduate till 64. And I am retired. I was a psychologist much of my life and writer, particularly on health care issues.
Okay, Alden?
Alden Briscoe, also class of 63, born in Mass General, grew up in New England on a farm, had a very checkered career, and the last 25 years, my wife and I have been doing fundraising consulting with nonprofits. And I guess I'd make the comment that from all the confessions of all of you, it's a good thing the statute of limitations has run out.
Mary, you're next. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm actually, I'm Corky White, but it always shows up as Mary. And it's thanks to Richie Rothstein that I'm on the screen this morning, and happy to be here, class of 63. I just half retired from Boston University, where I'm an anthropologist, which doesn't stop. And I'm off to, my field site has always been Japan, so I'm back there this fall for 2 months. And I live in Cambridge.
Okay, great. Liz?
Wait, may I ask a question? Are you the author of a cookbook?
I am. How did you know that?
Because I have it.
Oh my gosh. Well, I was trying to earn money to go to graduate school, and I didn't have any particular talents, and the only things open were typing or cooking, and so I chose cooking.
Doing that.
And then I was actually the caterer for the Center for European Studies at Harvard, and they had these elaborate lunches for 50 and 2 dinners a week for 25 each. And it was Henry Kissinger and all of those people. And so somebody just picked up the recipes from the front desk, and the next thing I knew, it was a cookbook. So
waiting for you to talk about it. And I said, well, maybe they have the wrong person.
thank you for bringing it up. I've recovered it a bit because I'm actually a food anthropologist. So there you go.
So great. I love it. Yeah.
I want to buy your cookbook. I'm Liz Morey. I identify as a Californian, although I've lived almost half my life on the East Coast. I'm currently in Tacoma Park, Maryland, outside of DC, here because of my kids and grandkids. I am Hamp and I get into conversations about I am a, quote, almost completely retired clinical psychologist. And the other thing that I always try to bring in is, I'm class of 63, is that I am very much the descendant of enslaving ancestors and am very interested in pursuing that part of my lineage. My grandmother's family got here in 1640. My grandfather's family got here in 1715 in Virginia. My grandfather left for Butte, Montana, and never looked back, which is why this has only been a more recent concern of mine.
Okay, Jerry.
I'm Jerry Secundi, and full Pasadena, California, where I've lived for the last 50 years. Class of 63, Columbia Law, Cusco, Peru for the Peace Corps. And unlike you guys having fun freshman year, I had to study, so I didn't flunk out. So my hat's off to you.
Okay.
No
excuse. Hamp Howell, class of 63. When you were all talking about your undergrad experiences, I on one hand, I was glad to hear about it. On the other hand, within a few years after I graduated, I didn't feel very connected with Harvard, and when I'd been involved in the social turmoil in the country, but not in the turmoil in Harvard.
Okay.
And that's it.
Jeff. Jeff.
Oh, okay. Jeff Fox, also class of 63. My freshman year, now that you've mentioned it, was almost a total loss academically. I mean, I was too busy discovering things. I could stay up all night. Nobody was in order me to go to bed, and and so I was missing 8 a.m. classes because I wanted to study Russian, and I didn't make enough classes, so I've only barely learned. I know very little Russian now, unfortunately. But anyway, when I finally sort of got things together, and after I graduated, I focused on Latin America. I was writing and teaching sociology for years. I'm now living in southern Spain and writing fiction.
Okay, David Lillebaugh.
63. I'm in New York City, where I'm from. But in the meantime, I spent a lot of time in other places. I went to the University of Chicago for graduate school and taught at the University of Minnesota. But mostly I've spent time in India. I'm a historian of India.
Okay, Doug.
Doug Shapiro, currently living in Louisville, Kentucky, although I grew up in Houston. I've had 3 different careers. The first was in clinical medicine after I graduated from Case Western Reserve University with an MD degree. I then went to England after a while and spent 6 years doing a PhD in animal behavior, and spent about the following.
Nice thing now. Why don't you join it?
Following 15 years studying the behavior of changing coral reef fish. Much of that time was in Puerto Rico. While I was there, Hamp came and lived there for a while, and we had some rather unusual experiences together.
Marcy.
I run a nonprofit in New York City that engaged in major resource allocation battles that are all relevant to what's happening today. and I'm overwhelmed with way too many tasks.
Okay. And Ed Larson, thank you for joining us. Tell us about yourself and the book.
Wow, it's an honor to join you all. What a interesting collection of people with interesting lives. Gosh, I don't even know where to begin. I am my only Harvard connection is my law degree. And I lived on Berkeley Street, where some of you know, sort of behind the commander's palace. I I lived on the third floor of an old house that was built by Longfellow on the back of his property for his nephew, and was then separately owned by a law professor named Sutherland. And so I lived on the top floor and took care with one other law student and took care of the house and had a wonderful walk across Cambridge Commons to school. But that's my only Harvard connection. And I'm sure I would have been much happier. I ended up having part of my college at University of Michigan. So the person in Ann Arbor, I sympathize with you living in the worst weather I've ever lived in. I hated the weather in Ann Arbor, but I loved the university. And my PhD is from Wisconsin, where I loved the weather. It's nice and crisp, cold, sunny days in the winter, unlike Ann Arbor, which hovers at 32 degrees and slush and overcast. But anyway, I did love my time in, I'll be back in Boston briefly, a couple times this fall, twice. So I always like to get back to Boston. Some of the other places, Aiken, South Carolina, you've certainly got some interesting, that gets into my eugenics book. They used to sterilize people there. It's one of the last places to forced sterilization, and you could only get your welfare benefits if you got sterilized. Interesting town. Pasadena, of course, not too far from where I live now, and I used to be on the board out at the Huntington. What a wonderful place. So many of you have done such incredible stuff. This book came about. I have a lot of other books, and this book came about. I've been interested in the topic, but when COVID came, I had a lot of time to do a lot of deep research. And so I view this as my COVID project. And I guess it came out because there was a lot of, I have other books on the Revolutionary era that I'm a historian of science. So doing issues of race fits right in to be a historian of science. That's what my PhD is in, history of science and medicine, for those of you who are medical writers. So I did history of medicine. My major professor was actually a historian of medicine. And so this has been a topic, and I have a book on Jefferson. So I know quite a bit about Jefferson's sort of quasi pseudoscience study of race. And I had worked with Morton. I published things on his work and basically the science of racism. David Hume in England, I'd been over and worked on his papers. So I worked on those areas. And both the 1619 project had come out, and the first Trump administration's answer, they put the president, I think he was president of that little school in Michigan, that conservative school in Michigan. They had put him in charge of doing a response to the 1619 project. And neither really involved historians. One was a journalist and the other was a ideologue. And so with the time, and I'd written a book on Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, and he from Boston. I'm get a Bostonian in now, and he had been very involved in the issues of race, and he became the first president of the first abolitionist society in the United States. Not just freeing individuals, but total abolition. And so I'd worked on Franklin, I'd worked on Jefferson, I'd worked on some of these others. And neither those two contending reports, the one out of the Trump administration and the one out of 1619, struck me as quite right. And neither of them were documented. Neither of them had any credible historical research. Neither of them, none. So I decided, well, I've got time. COVID shut everything down. I know law and I know history of science and I know the Revolutionary era. So I just took the period from, and I had known, of course, Edmund Morgan was one of my heroes as a historian. And he'd written a book about, I'm trying to think of the name of it. It was about slavery in Virginia during the 1600s. That was an earlier period. I actually worked with his editor, as my editor, at W.W. Norton. And I decided to focus on what's generally referred to as the Revolutionary era. Historians, they differ on the period of the American Revolution, but I think the most dependable periodization of the American Revolutionary era was 1765, which is when the Stamp Act crisis occurred. You can go back a little earlier to the Quebec Act, but I think 1765 works best. And 1795, because you could stop in 1793, but once the Washington administration gets firmly entrenched, we're no longer in the Revolutionary era. But it does sort of generally viewed as going somewhat beyond the Constitutional Convention and the drafting of the Bill of Rights and ratification. So somewhere in there. And so I just covered that period, and I decided to just try the best of my ability. And I love archival work. Cross every T, dot every I and J, and just really find out about the issue of where the issues of liberty and slavery stood during that period. And that's what I tried to do. I was pleased that when it came out, Henry Holzer, who is a Lincoln Prize winner, probably, I think, the best living historian. I know there's a Harvard professor who has written a book on Lincoln, but I think Holzer is generally considered the finest Lincoln historian today. And he wrote the review for the Wall Street Journal, and it's a very long review. It's a whole page of the weekend section of the Wall Street Journal, and he finally concludes in the end and says, well, now we know what happened. It's up to us to decide what to do about it. And that's, to me, was the most satisfying conclusion on it. And basically, if you've looked at the book, basically it chronicles that that period, that slavery was firmly, and race-based slavery was firmly entrenched in America when that period begins. 1765, firmly entrenched in every state, including Massachusetts. And it really was a chattel slavery of a sort that had never been known in world history until Barbados. Sort of started in Portugal somewhat, but then Barbados in the mid-1600s, where you own the children too, the children by the mother, of course, not by the father, by the mother. And it's race-based, and it's true chattel slavery. That is, the human beings are no more than animals, owned animals, domesticated animals. That came to the United States and in South Carolina in the late 1600s, when the Barbatans came up, when the whites who had settled in Barbados were pushed off the farms due to the expansion of the sugar plantation agriculture, and were recruited to settle the newly formed colonies of the Carolinas, recruited to go there, and they brought with them the Barbados Slave Code. And from Barbados, then it was adopted in Virginia and other states. Virginia didn't have chattel slavery before that. That's why it's sort of confusing. They did get enslaved people from, but they were basically life, because they didn't have because slavery, of course, as I assume you all know, was totally illegal in England, absolutely illegal. And as the court cases said, the English air is too pure to breathe. That as soon as you step foot on the soil, your slavery is ended. There had not been slavery in England since Roman times, and but you could have slavery by affirmative law, natural law. The English common law, slavery is illegal. You can have life. You can have indentured servants, and that can be for life, which is how the first enslaved the people from the captured slave ships that were Portuguese going to Brazil, taking the enslaved people to Brazil to work the sugar plantations, got to Virginia in 1619, but they were enslaved for life because they were indentured servants. By law, they couldn't be anything more. But you could pass this, as those of you who are lawyers know, you can always pass a statute that overrules the common law. And that's what they did with the Barbados Slave Code in Barbados, and then in South Carolina, and then ultimately in Virginia, and the other colonies. That you passed a statute that overruled the common law, which didn't allow chattel slavery. That is, you're born enslaved. And with those new codes, and those were firmly entrenched in America by the time of the American Revolutionary era. I call that 1765. And then the issue came with these people who were revolting for their liberty from England. How can they own enslaved people? Now you already had Hume writing, and you had, and of course the fundamental constitutions of South Carolina, which of the Carolinas which allowed chattel slavery, were written by John Locke of all people, who thought that by natural law you couldn't have slavery, which of course was the rule in England. But if you passed a statute, and so the colonies, did not concede themselves to be under Parliament. They conceded themselves to be directly under the king, and that their assemblies were their equivalent of Parliament. And that's why the old motto of Virginia was, I want to get this right. And Virginia either makes 4 or 5, because you had England and you had Ireland and you had Scotland. And so I guess that was Virginia, the old motto of the colony of Virginia. Virginia makes 5 because it was the first English colony. And they viewed their assembly, the House of Burgesses, to be the equivalent of Parliament. And so if it passed a law, it would be effect. Well, that's what they were revolting against, that Parliament, with the Stamp Act and then with the Declaratory Act, was inserting themselves between the colonies and the king. And that was a fundamental part of the revolution. So now, if they thought we want liberty, can we have slavery? Isn't that fundamentally opposed? So Ben Franklin concluded. That's what John in England, in Massachusetts, that's what Hancock concluded. That's what Samuel Adams concluded. Abigail leaned that way. She sort of sympathized with that very much. Mercy Warren did too. Otis, I always get the order of her name wrong. Certainly Otis did. But of course, by the time of the Revolution, he had lost his, he was no longer corpus mentis, but he certainly was involved early. And you see that in the writings of a lot of these revolutionaries, but not all, not Jefferson, not Madison, not Washington, not all. And so while it is true that the first great emancipation in world history was the American Revolution, It ended up being the northern states, Massachusetts, of course, by its constitution, Pennsylvania by gradual emancipation by statute that was pushed by the Abolitionist Society. Rittenhouse was involved in that, of course, Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Paine thought that it was fundamentally against the idea of liberty to have enslaved people. But you also have all the enslaved people and the freed Africans. There were a lot of freed blacks in America because, of course, in Virginia you had a lot because in the first century, the children wouldn't be enslaved. In Massachusetts, you had many freed blacks. So in Pennsylvania, you did. So there were, but the freed blacks rallied around this view that with the Declaration of Independence, with the new state constitutions, and of course, once they overthrew the king, and that happened as a process over 1776. That's the topic of my next book that's coming out in November. The states all had to write new constitutions. Not Rhode Island and Connecticut, because that's an exception, because Rhode Island and Connecticut were not royal charters. They were issued during the English Civil War by the Parliament. So they didn't need to. But every other colony / state had to write a new constitution. And then the question is, well, if we're a Republican, what do we do with slavery? And that's when you get Massachusetts, Vermont, which is sort of a state. So it never really been a colony. New Hampshire, abolishing slavery, and you get Pennsylvania and eventually Connecticut and New York and New Jersey, the northern states, abolishing slavery. So that really by the time of the Constitution, drafting of the Constitution, the northern states had virtually all either abolished slavery or were in the process of gradual abolition. That is, the children were no longer born enslaved, which was the case in New York. While the South, in contrast, had doubled down on slavery, they had decided that part of their fundamental liberty was the liberty to own enslaved people. Some of them had to come up with justifications that blacks are not people. Jefferson, of course, works on that in the Notes of Virginia. However they got there. And so the southern states had doubled down on slavery. And so I deal with the whole process. And many Africans were tremendously involved with this, both enslaved Africans and free African Americans were very much involved with this process, very much engaged, a lot of agency there. And then they get to the Constitution, which is where my story begins to end. It finally ends in the first Washington administration. But at the Constitutional Convention, they get together, and they really hadn't been much together because the Confederation Congress was a pretty inept organization. It rarely had a quorum. But they get there, and the people from those who supported a new constitution from the South, and the impetus for a constitution was basically a trading union. They wanted whatever else, they needed a national market economy. And that's what they really cared about. They got there, and the Southerners for the first time realized that these people in the North truly opposed slavery. I mean, it's just, this is not a whim. They truly oppose slavery, at a fundamental level. The white leaders of the North, as well as the black leaders in the North, they really are opposed to slavery. And the Northerners get there, and they used to think, this slavery is dying everywhere. They realize it's not dying in Virginia. It's not dying in Maryland. It's not dying in Georgia or the Carolinas. It's so incredibly firmly attached attached there. And so one of the big puzzles of the Constitutional Convention is how you draft a constitution that is neither pro-slavery or anti-slavery. It is instead entrenches state control over that issue. That free states can protect their free, that slavery is never going to get into a free state. And the slave states can create a constitution that will protect slavery in the states. And so if you compare the Virginia plan, which was really drafted by Pennsylvania and Virginia jointly, the whole notion of states' rights is much stronger in the final constitution than in the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan gave the federal, the whatever you want to call it, they called it the general government. We could call it the central government. Certainly, they wouldn't call it a national government. They changed. They had to, on the fly, in those in those closed door proceedings in Philadelphia, they had to really make a transformation to add a lot of compromises to make sure what they ended up is they could take it back down to the South and get ratification on the guarantee that slavery was safe. But they could also have to take it to the North, which never would have ratified it if it didn't guarantee that slavery was abolished. And that's why they had among the compromises was the Northwest Ordinance. They had to adjourn the convention for 10 days so that all the members who were delegates to the Continental Congress or the Confederation Congress in New York, they all had time to go back and pass the Northwest Ordinance that assured there would be no slavery in the Northwest Territory, north of the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, there was assurance that there was slavery south of the Ohio River, because both sides needed to make sure that they had an avenue, a free soil avenue, where white people and also black people, but sort of, maybe, but certainly white people could go west from Massachusetts or Vermont or Pennsylvania and have no fear that Southerners were going to bring their enslaved people up across the Ohio River. They had to know there was an avenue of more states west, while the South had to be sure of an avenue where there were more slave states west, what became, Alabama, Mississippi, those states. They had to be sure of that, because they knew that their compromises on creating Congress, they carefully balanced it. If you ever wonder where they came up with the 3/5 compromise, their best guess was that if you had a 3/5 compromise, the South, of course, wanted every enslaved person to count as one. They couldn't vote, but for representation. The northern states, and they were very vehement about this, they didn't want enslaved people to count at all because they couldn't vote. They weren't people. And they wouldn't want to count toward Congress. 3/5 rather than 1/2. They originally thought about 1/2. The 3/5 makes it so the best they could guess, and they didn't have a census, but they had a pretty good sense of it, and they were almost dead on, is that you would have the same number of representatives from enslaved states with slavery as a free state. It would also balance the presidency, because of course the whole idea of the Electoral College, nobody really wanted an Electoral College, but they came up with it because that way the enslaved states and the free states would have about equal representation in the Electoral College. That was a last-minute compromise. But they knew the Senate was going to be evenly balanced, because they knew that as soon as they adopted the Constitutional Convention, Vermont, Tennessee, and Kentucky would come in, which they did. And that would give an equal tie in the Senate. You would have 8 and 8. You have 16 states, 8 and 8. And then thereafter, they always adopted states, paired. They adopted a slave state and a free state in pair to keep because they didn't want either either the free states wouldn't have more, they wouldn't allow more enslaved states in Congress and the Senate. And the same way worse. They realized, well, as Madison said at the Constitutional Convention, he realized all this other stuff, small state, large state, northern state, southern state, agricultural state, manufacturing state, none of this matters. As he said repeatedly at the Constitutional Convention, we have it in his own notes, he says, all that matters is if you're a free state or a slave state. That's the only thing that really matters. And so that's the story I get to tell. And then how it follows through with Washington in the Washington administration, and how it follows through with how the Bill of Rights is very carefully crafted so it doesn't end slavery. The reason why there wasn't a Bill of Rights out of the Constitutional Convention is they were afraid it was going to overturn the compromises on slavery. But Madison very carefully wrote them that just says Congress shall make no law. They ended up, and then they add the end amendments, the states, the states' rights amendments, and they're all carefully drafted to preserve state-sanctioned slavery, but not to impose slavery where the state had decided otherwise. Otherwise, there's no way any northern state would have ever ratified the Constitutional Convention. So it's a great story, but it's not the story that is either in the 1619 Project or in the Trump administration's rebuttal to it. Anyway, I probably talked way too long, but that's the story I tell in American Inheritance, meaning American Inheritance. Both liberty and slavery are in America's DNA.
Okay. John.
Wonderful.
You muted. You muted.
Sorry. Listen, I wonder what sort of records of these deliberations and, backroom talk discussions did you have to find to piece this story, their arguments, and who left records that you had access to, and which were the most interesting?
Well, there's a lot of records. I mean, obviously, there's Madison's notes on the convention, and they're surprisingly honest. Everybody knows those. But if you piece them together, it depends on how you piece them together. But if you piece them together with an eye to slavery, it jumps right out at you. Because Madison was a big supporter of slavery, and he's fundamentally interested in the issue of slavery. And it's like one of those sort of hidden puzzles. Once you see what you're looking for, it's there. But there's also letters. These people wrote a lot of letters. We have a lot of letters from all these people. And then for the Constitution, you have the ratifying conventions. You have meticulous notes of some of them. Massachusetts, South Carolina, meticulous notes, every word recorded. And then you add to that, and some of the other states. Some you don't have all that much, but you still have the letters. And then if you get the key delegates, you can trace down their letters and their writings, and you can see what they're writing back or saying, and what they're commenting on. And you also get the key defenders of slavery, like Patrick Henry, or the key opponents of slavery, like there were a variety of people in especially Massachusetts, but also in Pennsylvania, who were key sort of linkage opponents of slavery, pro-abolition, who really worked at a higher level. The church, the old Puritan church, which of course had been pro-slavery. Winthrop was a supporter of slavery. Jonathan Edwards was a supporter of slavery. But they had flipped by the time of the Revolution, and you get the old Congregational church, I guess you'd call it, had become truly as much as it, the thing you almost have to have in your head is, for comparison today, is the way the evangelical church in America today flipped and to become anti-abortion in about 1980. Before that, of course, the Southern Baptists supported abortion, but they flipped. And that was almost like the Congregational Church did on slavery. But it's not just the Congregational Church, it's also the Methodist Church to an extent, the Presbyterian Church to an extent. And, earlier you look at the Quakers, but not during this time. They were at best trailers. But you can get their leaders, many of whom went to Yale. I hate to say it, being doing a Harvard group, but many of them went to Yale. Even though earlier Yale had been quite a center of pro-slavery, it became quite the breeding ground of anti-slavery, and at least in the religion, much more so than Harvard. And so it becomes really quite, there's a whole, you follow the state, in Massachusetts, they have to ratify the Constitution in each town, and we have all their deliberations. It's just a wonderful, it's a great thing for COVID. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing to unpack. And you get some surprises. People like John Hancock, how strongly he was opposed to slavery. He had inherited his enslaved people. He never had any before. He inherited from his uncle. And he basically told them, okay, you can come, but you come as a free person. You don't come as an enslaved person. And same way with Samuel Adams. Not John Adams, not so much. He was too pragmatic. But you really can unpack these people, but also how many you can, especially in Massachusetts, you can even follow a lot of the formerly enslaved blacks and the freed blacks and the enslaved blacks. They left a pretty good record. They had a Black Masons in Massachusetts that was very involved. They filed petitions. We have their petitions and their letters in support of them. A lot of them wrote in the newspapers, and I just read all that stuff and unpack it. It's a wonderful story. It's very, it shows you the best and the worst of humanity.
Hamp. What I will never understand, and I was bouncing up and down in my seat as much as an enfeebled old man can during the last half of this. If my fellow Yankees were so much against slavery, how could they ever have allowed this compromise, this provision where ICE of the 1800s could snatch away a black person from any place, anywhere, and put them back into slavery? They could grab somebody out of New York City or Michigan or wherever and lock them up.
Wonderful point, because the one compromise that really excited enormous opposition in the North was the Fugitive Slave Clause. They could buy the rest because they did not view themselves as a nation. They viewed themselves as separate states. And so if a state wanted to have it, okay. That was the sort of the sense. Now, some of them were stronger than that. Some of them wouldn't buy even that. But most of them said, well, I'm morally opposed. Slavery is so fundamentally wrong. Black people are equal with white people. All that. But if Carolina wants to treat them differently, okay. But you're right. The one clause was the Fugitive Slave Clause. And that's why Massachusetts was very, very close in ratification. And the reason was entirely that. If you can go back to what was happening in the various towns, you can come back to the vote at the ratification at the state convention, and it was all turning on the Fugitive Slave Clause. So you're absolutely right. That was an enormous problem. And of course, it was very tough to enforce in the North because you couldn't get a jury ever in Massachusetts. So If they had to bring it before a jury, because of course the person they captured would say, I'm not a runaway from that owner. And they would be defended locally. And it was finally when they later changed the law, the fugitive slave law that is allowed by the fugitive slave clause. The clause just allows Congress to pass a law to say that you could, and this ends up leading to the Civil War, that you don't need to take it to a jury, that simply an affidavit written by the guy sending out to catch the Southerners sent out to catch the slave. But you're absolutely right. That was and I write about that in the book. The problems people had with they viewed that as the only part of the Constitution. The Constitution never uses the word slavery for intentionally because it couldn't pass in the North if it included it. It wasn't because Madison had compulsions of using the term. But that was the one that many people would say that was the one clause in the Constitution that affirmatively endorses slavery.
Richard, you muted. Rich.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is fascinating. You started out by saying that does the book really compare the 1619 project and the 1776 curriculum? No. Okay.
No, I don't see any point. I saw nothing to be gained. I didn't want to write a negative book. What I wanted to do was write the story, write what happened. And I'll let other people do the other. I do not do any. In fact, I intentionally wash those out of my head. I didn't, and I think that was the right strategy. I didn't want to just nitpick because a lot of the spirit of the 1619 project is good. It just is not based on any historical research. It's based on, by their own account, it's based on two books, neither of them by historians.
David Lillibah.
Yes, thank you for this. I was wondering to what extent you think, as you're reading written documents, that the opposition to slavery in the North was motivated entirely by moral principles and not by economic interests and such, so that the manufacturing states and the states with a different kind of seasonal agriculture and so on had less reason to have slavery than the Southern, perhaps. And does that ever come up, economic interest? And of course, the slave traders were many of them from, or mostly from the North. The ships that sailed out of Massachusetts and other places, Rhode Island.
Well, of course, it came up all the time. Of course, the Southern states, people like Patrick Henry and all the Southern pro-slavery people, that's all they talked about. They said, you're just hypocrites. You don't have any practical need for enslaved people up there because of the type of agriculture you have. Certainly the Northerners, I mean, these people were not stupid. They realized that too. I mean, was there ever a more practical person in the history of the world? Well, ever a more intelligent practical person in the history of the world than Benjamin Franklin. And of course, he knew exactly what was happening. So yes, economics was an issue. Religion also was an issue, which is a little different than morality. The North, of course, was the religious area back then. The South was not religious, and religion was a factor. And I try to analyze the New Light Congregationalists / Presbyterians, and their thinking on slavery. They believed of course, from the Puritan tradition, they believed you had to demonstrate your faith. And you demonstrate your faith through disinterested love and showing love that doesn't benefit you. And the part of the theology, and I sort of go into this at great length, part of that theology was that what better way to show disinterested love
1:00.
than to oppose slavery, because that's not going to benefit you at all. It's an example, so it shows your belief in Christian love. Showing love to your children doesn't show anything. So there's a religious element. There's certainly a moral element. The moral element is right out of the Enlightenment. And that was what motivated a person like Ben Franklin. They were motivated by that, but certainly they recognized the economics were different. And certainly they realized, absolutely, when they did and it was a key element, when they did the Northwest Ordinance, they realized that if we oppose slavery, if we're building a family farm free labor economy, both small manufacturing, but also family farm, we can't compete with enslaved labor. So we need free soil. And of course, that's what Lincoln was for. Lincoln was, didn't believe in the equality of blacks. That's an understatement. Illinois, Illinois was a state created by the Northwest Ordinance. Of course, until the Civil War, you couldn't be black in Illinois. It was against the Constitution of Illinois. The idea was, we got to open if we allow Virginians to come to Ohio with their enslaved people, there won't be any place for us non-slaveholding small family farmers. So certainly economics was all, and I worked through that. It was all integrally. What do they say? Law is a seamless web. It's all mixed together in a complex web that it's why it takes longer for states like Connecticut and New York, because enslaved labor was practical in the Connecticut Valley. It was practical in the Hudson Valley. It was practical in the Delaware Valley. In those places, enslaved labor did work. Look at Hamilton's family. I mean, Hamilton bought and sold enslaved people his entire life until he was shot in New Jersey. His family was one of the largest holder of enslaved people, the family he married into, of course. John Dickinson, the so-called Pennsylvania farmer, he was no farmer. He had plantations, but he was a lawyer. And he owned more enslaved people than anybody else in Pennsylvania and Delaware. So you have to, but the economics, it differs on where you are in those states. It's not automatic. And then, of course, house enslaved people were very useful for rich people in New York City or in Boston or in, and of course, the Connecticut Valley goes on up into Massachusetts, which that would be true. So, and of course, yes, you're right. After the Revolution, a lot of the enslaved people were carried on colonial ships. It's true, after the Revolution. And that factors into why Connecticut went along with these compromises, because the compromise on continuing the slave trade for southern states that wanted to do so to 1808. And Connecticut was going to carry a lot of those enslaved people from Africa. But before the Revolution, most of those, the Americans were not main British people living in the United States. Most of the enslaved trade was on British ships, some on Portuguese too, but mostly on British, because the royal family had a certain monopoly on the slave trade to the Americas. And that's where, Sierra Leone and the slave factories, and those were tied to the British. So, but after the Revolution, that's certainly true. The American ships were carrying most of the enslaved people.
Mm-hmm. Jeff.
Yeah, this is much of this is new to me, and I'm not sure that I'm following everything that you've said. but I thought you talked about free blacks and slave blacks both being very much involved in the debates around slavery in the early years at the beginning of this process. Was that right? And if so, if they were actually expressing themselves, how were they doing it, and what were they saying?
Well, I said they were very involved. There was a lot of agency. How much of it was written and oral, I do go into that. But when the revolution comes, by 1775, when the revolution's fully underway as a fighting revolution, before the Declaration of Independence. By 1775, it was pretty clear that if you were an enslaved Black in the North, if you joined the fighting militia, whether it was Rhode Island or Massachusetts, you would be free. So this is beyond conversation. So there was a tremendous rush of enslaved Blacks in places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, to an extent in New York and in Pennsylvania, to join the Patriot militia to gain your freedom. Now, it was the reverse in the South. The Southern colonies and states would not give a gun to a Black person. There were, of course, more. Percentage-wise, there were many more. There was a real fear of slave revolts in the South. There was no fear of slave revolts in the North because there weren't enough enslaved people to do a revolt. But there were in South Carolina or Virginia. So they wouldn't give a gun. But what the British smartly did, and it wasn't just Dunsmore, it was the Clinton who was in charge of everything. They said that any enslaved person of a rebel, not of a loyalist, but any enslaved person of a rebel, if they leave the plantation or wherever they're enslaved, if they're a house enslaved person, and join the British, you'll get your freedom. So, dozens and dozens, virtually all of Jefferson's enslaved people just fled. They just left. And many of Washington's did. Whenever they could see British troops nearby, they would flee to them. Now that's agency. In all my research, I never encountered an enslaved person who wanted to remain enslaved. Never. They all wanted to be free. But they also protested. There would be marches where the enslaved people would get together and march through Charleston's when they'd hear these things about liberty for us too. And but there were also written in Massachusetts, there was a tradition. In Massachusetts, enslaved people were typically taught to write and read, which wasn't true in the South, where it was illegal under some of the slave codes. And they would write petitions. We have a lot of them to the Massachusetts legislature assembly asking for slavery to be abolished. They would write articles that appeared in local newspapers saying you're calling for liberty. We want liberty for ourselves. And so there was the Black Masons in Boston that would formally petition. There were African American clubs. There was that poet in Cambridge, Phyllis Wheatley. So it's expressed in some of her poems. So yeah, you get it's more in actions than in written words, but it's also in written words.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. I grew up in Massachusetts and didn't come to South Carolina until fairly late in life, about 30 years ago or so. And since then, I've learned a fair amount about South Carolina history, including the history of slavery and Jim Crow and so on and so forth, which I had a vague idea about before. I hadn't heard about this thing of forced sterilization that you mentioned. I took the opportunity to look it up, and I came upon a New York Times article from 1937. And I guess there was an obstetrician here in Aiken
Yes.
who was doing that. If a woman was unmarried and had 3 children, he would force her to get sterilized or not help her, and And he did that supposedly to save on Medicaid, which I found fascinating. It's
Yeah.
not something that was widely, I had not heard of that, even though I've lived in Aiken for 30 years or so, until you mentioned it. So I'm quite fascinated by that. Very interesting.
Yeah. I wrote a book once. I have a book called Sex, Race, and Science, Eugenics in the Deep South. And it's the story of eugenics in the South. And it covers that story. It covers South Carolina. You have quite a history in South Carolina. You either have to laugh or cry.
Yeah, I'm sure you're
My
right.
favorite was your governor. Favorite in a, I'm talking about in a pathetic sense. You adopted a law in Connecticut for forced sterilization of people who were mentally deficient. In the 30s, the law was proposed by a state senator named Strom Thurmond, and it became law, but it only applied. Oh, this is too South Carolina. It only applied in state institutions, so you had to be in the state hospital, the mental health hospital, or the state home for what they called back then the feeble-minded. But they were racist. They were white only. So you could only sterilize back then white people in the state prison or in the state mental hospital. But when they had forced when after in the 50s, when the desegregation came and they forced the desegregation of the state hospital and the state home for the feeble-minded, South Carolina had very few sterilizations compared to Georgia and North Carolina. I researched all the numbers. We were talking about maybe 20, 30, 40 a year. Suddenly, when the blacks start being in these schools, the number skyrockets to like 1,000. And what they're doing is the governor of South Carolina, a guy named Fritz Hollings, who later was in the Senate, Fritz Hollings would take all the black prisoners in the prison in South Carolina, and he'd commit them to the state hospital for a day. They'd move them over, they'd sterilize them all and send them back. So you have quite a story in South Carolina, and I document that all in the book, Sex, Race, and Science.
Yeah,
I mean, it's pathetic. You don't know whether to laugh or cry.
Yeah.
And I hate to say this, but your state hasn't changed very much. It's as bad now as it was then, and just in different ways.
Yeah, I go along with that. There's spots of more liberal thinking here in places.
Yeah, there are. Well, there were then.
Yeah.
But those are just spots.
Yeah.
Connie.
Yay. First, I have a couple of anecdotes about my family and then a question. First is that I was interested to hear that in the 1700s, there were children of enslaved people may have been free, because my mother's family was free back in the 1700s, and that sort of gives me maybe an idea of how that happened. Second, one of her relatives took action based upon that belief that if you had set foot in England, you could always be free. And I heard the story that he actually booked a trip to England so that he could step his foot on English soil and maybe get a document to that effect, I don't know, and then come back, and he would not run the risk of being enslaved. So I thought that was interesting to hear, because that's part of my family history. My other question is, hearing all these twisting and turning and compromises, why wasn't it ever seriously considered to have two countries?
That's a good
Well,
question.
Civil War.
That's a great question. That is a very serious question. That's what Patrick Henry wanted. Patrick Henry opposed ratification because he wanted to have a Southern Confederation. That was Patrick Henry's idea. So yes, they did think about it. And really, what was eye-opening for me, one of the eye-opening things is when they got to the Philadelphia Convention, it really surprised them to hear how much the North had turned against slavery, but also how much the South had doubled down.
But they didn't take the road of saying, okay, let's split.
Yeah. And I think and there were people. That's what the opponents of ratification, most of them sort of thought that way. Let's have a Northern Confederation that's free at a Southern Confederation. So they did think about that, but their economics prevailed. And the so-called nationalists, if you want to call them that, they later called themselves Federalists, were mostly economically driven. And they wanted, sort of like the common market in England, they really wanted a national market economy, because they, really, when you take the whole thing, we're only talking about 3 or 4 million people. The diversity of products you could get from the South and the North. The big source of foreign trade was Southern tobacco. Increasingly, cotton was envisioned, and rice. The Southern were the export crops. There was certainly food from the North, but foodstuffs, fish from New England, but mostly it was the Southern crops. And the Northerners were mostly the traders and the manufacturers who were going to then use the cotton and make textiles, or use the sugar and make rum, or the practical people wanted a big enough country to be truly economically viable. And before the Constitution, each state was a free economic entity. So they would have tariffs on the other states. So you couldn't freely exchange goods. And that's the purpose of the Constitution, is to have a common market, a national market economy. And so the nationalists believed that the range of states and the range of products and the manufacturing and the range of commerce and the timber from the North to make ships, that, the timber in the South wasn't as good for ship making. It was that diversity that overcame them. But certainly there were people on the other side. In the North, probably the most visible person associated with that was Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, member of the, became a senator from New York. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention, wrote the "We the People" line, wrote the preamble. And the most visible person associated with that in the South would have been Patrick Henry, but a lot of the others too. And so that was a debate. And if a constitutional convention hadn't succeeded, that's what we would have ended up with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Doug,
good question.
Yes. So Ken Burns has produced a number of very well-produced films that cover some of the periods of history that we've been discussing here. My question is Ken Burns a good historian?
He's not a historian at all.
No.
He relies on historians. But he's an excellent cinematographer, or whatever, producer, or whatever skills are involved in producing these documentaries. He's a great maker of documentaries, but he's only as good a historian. They are only as historically accurate as he is getting historians. And I'm hoping, I haven't seen the one on that's coming out this fall. Hope he has a good team. His jazz one, I thought he had a great team of jazz historians with the jazz ones. I view his documentaries as mixed. Some of them are really good. I thought the Civil War he had a great team with the Civil War. So I think he tries to be, my opinion, and it's not based on anything, any inside knowledge. My instinct is he tries to be as accurate as he can be, and he tries to get the best people. But he's also telling a story, so you always need to take the storytelling aspect into context. That'd be my my opinion of him. I think, and again, some of them were really absolutely fabulous.
Great. Well, Ed, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really great, and good luck with the book.
Well, that's an older book, but thank you and Kent, thank you for, I guess I thank the New York Review of Books for belatedly doing a review.
Yeah.
I thought it was a fine review. And I think, Kent, I think you've collected together, this is an incredible group of people. Just from hearing their stories at the beginning, it was just an honor and a privilege to be part of it.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. See you then.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kent.
That was Ed Larson. His new book is titled American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. I'll talk to you again next week.